Okay, hello. I will be doing a motion analysis on the motion that you see on the screen here. First things first, just a quick disclaimer, my thoughts on this motion are neither exhaustive nor necessarily the correct way to see things, and it's perfectly plausible that you might heavily disagree with the bulk of what I might be saying here, but here are some thoughts anyway. So first things first, let's just look at the start of the motion. So as you can see, I don't have slides because I don't know, I like to jump on the opportunity to, use a virtual whiteboard where possible because I think it's just cool. So first things first, this house supports, oops, yeah, this house supports this part, right? Um, what does this mean? This means that firstly, it's not a policy motion, so you don't have to support any specific set of actions to be implemented. It's also not a retrospective motion necessarily, and the reason why I say necessarily is because there might be instances where you come across a this house supports motion and they require you to support some sort of action that's already happened. In this case, I don't think there's any specific indication that proposition must defend some sort of phenomena that's taken place. So I think it's perfectly plausible for you to debate an entirely hypothetical debate about children's literature of this sort. Um, what else? Right. So what does this motion require you to do then? It probably requires you to explain what sort of literature this is and whether or not you prefer a world where it exists or you prefer a world where it doesn't exist, depending on what side you are on. So this is not a policy debate, but you would still benefit from some level of world building. This is the first thing I can write. World building. Please excuse my writing. Yeah, world building. So what exactly is world building, and how does it apply in this particular circumstance? World building is basically just explaining what kind of things you support. What does this world you support look like? And the reason why this is important is because if proposition isn't clear about this and they give some sort of vague notion of what this children's literature is like, and similarly, opposition also gives a very vague analysis of this, and neither side can actually agree on the specifics, then first, I think you stand to run the risk of the judge not understanding what exactly you're supporting either. But second, it's just really difficult to debate on something that's super vague. So that's why world building helps a lot to make sure that you have like a robust and nice debate. So, what are the things that you might want to include in this world building? I think the first thing is what this literature looks like. What is this literature? Just put lit for short. What is this literature like? I think there are a couple of things that you can say, and this probably applies to both proposition and opposition, although this would also depend on the kinds of arguments that you want to run. So I think firstly, this kind of literature is probably one where characters are um multifaceted, characters, multifaceted or complex, meaning that they're not just one-dimensional good guys, nor are they one-dimensional bad guys. I can't think of any examples off the top of my head, but I can think of some counter examples. So this literature would probably not include things like Harry Potter, because you've got people like Voldemort who like doing bad things for the sake of being evil. So that's probably not included in this debate. Um, Besides being complex, I think, and this one is something that I was kind of grappling with as well. I think on one hand, I was thinking about the anti-hero. Um, what is an anti-hero for people who are not sure? An anti-hero is basically a main character slash protagonist who doesn't have the traditional traits of a hero. So, for example, this person could be not brave, or this person could not be benevolent. Um, a good example of this would be Venom, I guess. Yeah, so that's an anti-hero. Um, why I say that this one's a bit more questionable is because on one hand, I could assume that the anti-hero is a pretty complex character, but on the other hand, it really depends, right? Because your anti-hero could just have very non-conventional traits, but still overarchingly be a good guy or a bad guy. So this one is like a, let's just leave it as a question mark. You could include it, you could not include it. Um, this is basically as opposed to shallow characters like the ones that we mentioned, right? One-dimensional people. People who are either overarchingly good, like your Harry Potter types, or people who are overarchingly bad, like Voldemort. Um, Question then about form. So I think that the discussion on form basically the medium of this literature. Is it only text, or does it also include film and other kinds of mediums? I think that those kinds of things are a bit irrelevant to the debate because this the motion doesn't really talk about form very much. So I think while you might want to mention this, it's also very unimportant. So I wouldn't get into this a lot if I were you. Yeah, so you could include examples of characters from movies just because like the characters and explaining those characters might be relevant, but it's up to you whether or not you want to include this form at all. Other kinds of things that you want to include in this world building, I think it would be whether or not this kind of literature exists as a sole narrative, um, or it coexists with other narratives, alternative narratives. So, what does this mean? This means that if you have children's literature like this, as you can see in the motion, there's no indication that you're supposed to support only this kind of literature existing, which means it's perfectly plausible for you to say that it is the sole narrative and perhaps explain why it's likely that in a world where you have this kind of literature, it might end up being the sole narrative, perhaps because it's more popular, perhaps because it makes other sorts of narratives seem a lot more superficial and therefore unpopular. That depends. Alternatively, you could say that there is no reason why it's going to be the only kind of narrative, so it's perfectly plausible that you also have literature alongside these kinds of books that also tell you about people either being bad or good in more absolute terms. What else? Right. So that's for world building. I'm just going to erase this and go to characterization next. Hold on, give me a moment. Oh my gosh, I just erased the motion. It's okay. You know what the motion is. Oops. Okay, characterization. So what exactly is characterization? Um, to put it really simply, I think characterization can be thought of as you giving attributes to people. Attributes. In this case, I think it would be relevant to give attributes to children specifically. So what kinds of characterizations can you include? And I think this could be characterizations that apply to both proposition and opposition quite equally. So the first one could be that children are impressionable. In other words, like you tell them something, they're very likely to either believe you or they're likely to emulate you. So the reason why this would be significant or important in the debate is because if you give them a certain narrative, it's very likely that they're going to be swayed by that narrative. Um, I think under this, you probably also want to suggest that this debate has to assume some level of impact. Assume impact. What this means is that you want to assume that at least some kids are going to be swayed by this narrative that we're talking about, because assuming that there is no impact, then it's unclear what the point of the debate is. So if like the thing exists and it doesn't exist and it makes absolutely no difference to anyone, then there is no actual value in the debate, and it kind of minimizes all the arguments that either side can bring. So there's probably going to be a consensus that this type of narrative is going to be influential to at least a significant group of children, if not all children. Um, and this is an important premise for a lot of your other arguments later on. Other kinds of things that you want to include in characterization of children, and just note because I've heard, I guess, a good number of debaters talking about it this way, but characterization need not be a separate category from all the other parts of your speech. And I think it would be most useful if you integrate your characterization either into your world building or into your arguments as premises, because as you know, like arguments are made of premises and conclusions. Premises, which means like all the building blocks of your argument, and conclusion, i.e., what the premises lead you to believe, or what you have to assume if you buy all the premises. Yeah. So I think this characterization could be included as a premise in your argument. So first, they're impressionable. Second, they're in their formative years. Formative years. What this means is that during this part of your life, you are probably still trying to form an identity, and therefore it is likely that things you're exposed to are going to shape your personality to a significant degree. shape personality. Yeah, so that's the kind of stuff that I would probably include in characterization. As you will see later, there are other parts of characterization that you could include in your arguments as opposed to in the contextualization or world building that you're doing before your arguments even happen. Yeah, so these are just some suggestions. Let's clear everything. Okay. Why is this not clearing? Clear all drawings. Ah, okay. Okay. Right. Yeah, so that's the first part. Um, Okay, I think we can go to proposition real quickly. So I won't be talking about a lot of arguments. I think there are just two key ones that I want to suggest. The first one for prop, so I'm just gonna write here prop in case you're looking and you don't know what I'm talking about. Yeah, proposition arguments. First one I think that I would run would be something about how it is crucial to have these narratives to teach kids a sense of empathy and forgiveness. So crucial to teaching empathy and forgiveness. Um, right. Why is that the case? So a couple of things that you probably want to include in your premises for this argument, right? The first being that, of course, necessarily you're going to have complex characters, because that is just the nature of this kind of literature, complex characters. And what this means when you develop complex characters is a number of things, right? The first one is that you might include background info about these characters. So, for example, the fact that they come from an abusive family, or perhaps the fact that they're predisposed to certain kinds of actions because of a condition that they have. So, this background info is probably the kind of background info that softens the extent of morality that you can attribute to certain actions. So, maybe the person shoplifted, but the reason why they shoplifted was because they were very desperate, something like that. Yeah, so it would have background info that kind of softens the extent of morality. The second thing that you want to talk about is that um these people do things that seem good, but for nefarious reasons, for self-interest or any other kind of like perverse incentive, or they do bad things for good reasons. So like perhaps it's a bit like your eco-terrorist kind of thing, right? So like maybe you blow up a pipeline, but it's because you want to save all the animals and the environment, which is very important. So yeah, maybe you do bad things for good reasons or because you just can't help it, like you're a victim of circumstance. What is the impact of all these things then? The impact of all these is that, of course, children are less likely to be judgmental of people just based off the surface and based off like their immediate interactions with these people. Like if you see someone doing something bad, you are less likely to jump the gun and assume that they are bad people. At the same time, I think it is probable that you can include complex characters as characters who do both good and bad things, both good and bad. And that's pretty much like everybody that you know, right? Like nobody does only bad things or nobody does only good things. So presumably the kinds of characters that you have in these types of literature or in this type of literature would be more realistic characters who are less like one-dimensional because they have like a hand in doing both good and bad things. What is the impact of all these things then? Okay, let's just draw an arrow here. The impact would be a couple of things, right? The first being that exposure to such characters, especially like many such characters, makes them less likely to be judgmental, as we said before. And it's also going to make them less likely to be blindly trusting. So there are a couple of things that you can write separately. The first is that they are less judgmental, less judgy. Let's just write judgy. Okay. And the second one is that they are less likely to act in a certain way based on their perception of someone. So less trusting, less blindly trusting. And then at the same time, um, they are also less susceptible to dehumanizing narratives, like either bigotry or like stereotyping and all those kinds of things. So this could be in an immediate circle kind of context where perhaps your family talks about people badly, or even on a wider societal level, perhaps like you see a lot of state propaganda about a certain group of people. And you probably want to suggest that, I'll just write it here, like less um less likely to accept dehumanizing. Oops. Oh man, dehumanizing. Okay, you know this word is dehumanizing narratives. Um, and I think for this particular part, you probably want to suggest that the way in which people convince children and those around them that all the narratives that are bad about certain groups of people are true is likely to be through anecdotal evidence. And this anecdotal evidence is likely to be like, oh, I've met 10 people of this particular group, and all 10 people are like XYZ. So it's definitely the case that they're all evil people. And the fact that you expose these kids to narratives that suggest that people are either not what they seem, or that people can be both good and bad, makes them a little bit more resistant to this kind of bigotry that is based on anecdotal evidence. Yeah, so that would be probably a first argument that you can suggest. Okay, let's see now. Right. Second argument then. Um, I think you can suggest that they are likely to see morality as a constant effort rather than a predetermined trait. So see morality as constant effort, not predetermined trait. And there are a couple of things that you can say under this, right? The first is that maybe you teach them that doing good things doesn't make you an a priori good person. Doing good is not enough. Like doing good once, for instance, not enough. So they can't be complacent and assume that um, past actions are sufficient, and they will instead be brought up to think that all your subsequent actions also contribute to the kind of person you are. And therefore, it is more likely that they're going to continuously aim and strive to do good things because they know that, like, all your past actions don't predetermine what kind of person you can be characterized as. I think the second part under this is that um, you can talk about how these narratives teach about good or bad behavior, but don't attribute this value system to the agent of these actions, so not agent. So what this means, for instance, is it is perfectly possible that in this kind of literature, you might suggest that lying is bad, but then you don't call the person who's a liar an evil person, or you don't make them out to be an evil person. So therefore, it is still possible that you could teach good and bad behavior, perhaps by showing that it is bad or good based on the impacts of people to people around the character. So for instance, perhaps stealing is bad because, oh look, you made the shopkeeper sad or something like that, right? Or good actions, like helping a person cross the street, and this is good because look at how happy that person is. So you can teach good and bad behavior based on impacts, and therefore gives children an understanding of what is morality without necessarily saying anything about the agent and that agent's inherent worth. Um, I think at the same time, you can talk about how this is important because it makes children grow up believing that they and those around them can redeem themselves. And this comes together with the characterization that, or rather the um, description of characters in this kind of literature as being people who do both good and bad things, right? So what this means is that you could have done like 1,000 things that have negative impacts, but then you can also do another 1,000 things that like bring positive impacts. And therefore, because of the fluidity in morality, or at least moral branding of the agent, it is perfectly possible that you can have committed mistakes. And this is particularly important because they are children, and children often commit mistakes because they're immature. Children, mistakes. And it's important for them to be able to forgive themselves because these past mistakes don't define who they are. and it's possible for them to rebuild themselves based on their future decisions. So in like all in all, it makes them more accepting of people who have committed mistakes, like their peers, and at the same time, it makes them more comfortable with themselves because they don't end up growing up with a sense of self-loathing because of something that they did in the past. I don't know whether you want to include Kite Runner in this, but like that's something that comes to mind, right? Like the whole narrative of someone doing something bad, and even though it was something so long ago, it is still like a damning trait for them. Right. So that's a couple of things that you can say in proposition. Opposition, just right up here. Okay, what can opposition say? A bunch of things as well. First things first, hold on, let me just take a look at my notes. Right. First, what exactly is the purpose of this literature? So as we talked about before, you probably want to suggest that all this literature has some level of impact because if not, there's no point in the debate. So the first thing you can suggest is that the purpose of this literature, purpose is to teach morality. Teach morality. And this is where I'm going to slot in the example of how you characterize and integrate the characterization within an argument. So in this case, I think one of the premises of this argument would be that it is kids are not able to perceive of morality in abstract terms or based on impacts. So children cannot understand morality in abstract. Yeah. So what you want to suggest here is one of two things, right? The first is that perhaps the impacts are not intuitive to them, or the impacts like don't seem to matter very much to them. So to suggest that someone does something bad and we should think that that thing is a bad thing because of impacts might be a very tall order for children because they can't access that kind of value attribution. But the second thing also is that perhaps the impacts are very intangible. So or like very difficult for even adults to grasp in most circumstances. So for instance, if you're trying to teach a kid that like lying is bad, it's very difficult to suggest that lying is going to help anyone. I'm sorry, it's going to harm anyone because like no one actually benefits when you admit to something that you did, right? And in fact, what they see is that they get harmed instead since like this is attributed to punishment and stuff. So the problem with this then, and note that this is an important premise in this argument, is that it is not possible or it's very difficult for you to find other modes of teaching children what this morality is. So the easy way for you to do this is to create role models or people that they don't want to follow, right? So anti-role models. So it's probably difficult for a child to access that they want to be like so and so person because oh that person is such a good person. So instead, in your traditional narratives, the reason why we know that certain people are good and other people are bad is not because of the actions per se, especially if you're a child, perhaps like as an adult you can access that, or even as like an older child. But as a young child, doing things like being generous or being honest are things that are not very intuitive to you, right? Especially if they go against your own self-interest. So the easy way for you to show that like people are good or bad is either by how society, in the story at least, reacts to them, or whether or not like they get a good or bad outcome for themselves. So I think like an easy example would be all your traditional fairy tales where the princess has certain good traits, like I guess Cinderella, and then in the end we know she's good because like she gets happily ever after, and we know that the stepsisters are evil because well they lead a very bad life after that, right? So the idea is that because this kind of literature is targeted towards children specifically, you need to give them very simple narratives so that it's easier for them to dismantle like these big ideas. Why is this important then? I think it is, you can suggest that it's important because first and foremost, um, at the end of the day, it is difficult to teach like the broad idea of morality, right? Like, for instance, you probably can't teach kids about the trolley problem because that's probably really unintuitive to them. But instead, you can suggest that, yeah, and perhaps like this is my bad, I shouldn't put this as a label. You can teach children about acceptable and unacceptable behavior. unacceptable behavior through these forms of literature. So why is this important then? You can suggest that it's important because if you show that acceptable behavior comes with good consequences for the main character and unacceptable behavior comes with bad consequences, then you probably can easily create some sort of like association between good behavior and good things, and therefore make these kids more inclined to do good things, right? The second thing also is that you want to suggest that all this is actually moral intuition. What this means is that there are certain things that we don't really think about as adults anymore. For instance, I guess most people would think that hitting someone unprovoked is a bad thing, and we don't really have to jump hoops to get to the conclusion that it's a bad thing. So that's what we call, I guess, moral intuition. And you can suggest that this is something inaccessible to children, and the best way for you to teach them is just to create this association between good and bad through these narratives, right? So you can also say that, of course, this comes at a trade-off, and this is how you probably engage with proposition, sorry, a little bit more. You can suggest that this comes at the cost of trying to prevent them from being susceptible to bigotry and stereotyping and stuff like that. But you can suggest that those kinds of things are easier to dismantle when you're older because they're often easy to fight off with simple logic, right? So for instance, like if you've met one person from a particular group, you can't make a logically sound assumption about everybody within that group. So therefore your stereotyping and bigotry doesn't make sense. Those kinds of um forms of reasoning are things that are easy for adults to access, whereas it's a bit more difficult to explain moral intuition to an adult who is fully formed and already has certain ideas about the world. For instance, whether or not things like death and life have inherent value and meaning. Like those kinds of things, therefore, are things you have to teach as children. And other kinds of things that are a bit more higher order and logic based can be taught when you are an adult. So that also brings some level of urgency to your arguments. Yeah. Besides this, I think you can suggest that it's just bad for kids to be brought up thinking that morality is fluid and stuff, because this means that assuming you don't have this moral intuition being put in at a young age, it is possible that you think all perverse behavior is acceptable because it has some legitimate grounds for justification. So you can say that everything can be justified. And of course, this is problematic because real people actually get hurt, but they become very immune to this reasoning of impacts just by virtue of the fact that they think nothing can be put into the category of good and bad. Yeah. Besides that, you could also suggest that this removes an incentive to be good because there is no principal value being attached to a person who does good things. So this kind of takes down a few of the premises that proposition talks about, right? Because the suggestion in proposition, if you recall earlier, was that actions can be taught to be good or bad. Opposition can suggest that this is difficult to do absent the value that you attribute to the agents of that particular behavior. So if I can't say that a person who like kills someone is a person who has done a bad thing and is therefore a bad person, it's very difficult for me to like divorce the action from the actor and somehow in that vacuum suggest that there is some sort of value to doing good things if it doesn't make you a good person, or conversely avoiding bad things, since like doing them doesn't make me a bad person either, but could perhaps make me happy in the short term. Yeah. So like with this kind of narrative, then it's very difficult to teach kids about acceptable and unacceptable behavior. And if you recall, like the earlier characterization that we talked about before we went into the proposition arguments, um, if you're able to prove that, or if you're able to suggest effectively that children are largely impressionable and that this the period that we're talking about are like is their formative years, and therefore all the things that they learn here are likely to not be very shakeable in the future, then you can suggest that all these impacts matter greatly because they are things that are going to shape the kind of people that we have growing up around us. Yeah, so that is one part of opposition. Other part of opposition. I think you can suggest that and this is another example of where characterization comes in. I think you can characterize children as being vulnerable actors, right, or vulnerable individuals. So the reason for this is the huge asymmetry of power that they experience in contrast to adults around them. So therefore, this means that when people do bad things to them, it is far harder for them to resist, and it's far more likely that they are reliant on other actors to be able to intervene for them. And this is premised on them first identifying that this particular thing is a bad thing and thinking that some sort of penalty should be introduced, right? So I think you can suggest that it is possible that these narratives implicitly gaslight kids into thinking or into like thinking that it is illegitimate for them to react negatively to people whose behavior harms them, right? So I think you can suggest that even in the status quo, regardless of whether or not you're exposed to these narratives, it's already difficult for kids to call out bad actors around them. So for example, close adults or other kinds of personalities, right? Like it's already so difficult for us to get kids to talk about abuse from close adults because in their minds, like these people ought to be trusted. So therefore, it is like you cannot reconcile trusted adult that you have identified with doing bad things. So there is already a pre-existing problem. And then this problem just becomes compounded when kids are taught this very confusing narrative that actually bad behavior, like can be excusable, and like bad behavior does not mean bad person. And by extension, especially if they are aware that there are going to be certain repercussions that happen to the individual who has done the bad behavior, then it's all the more problematic, right? Because assuming that all the premises and arguments in proposition are true, that these kids are more likely to be forgiving and to feel that people ought not to be punished for certain kinds of behavior because, you know, one form of action doesn't actually reflect on who they are as an overall person, then this is bad because they are all the more likely to not call out behavior. Yeah, so don't call out behavior. And here you can impact it a bit more by suggesting that, unlike when adults are faced with bad behavior, because of this asymmetry of power that you talked about before, the impact of being harmed by people around you is so much heavier for children because they can't do anything to fight it, and because um, it is just way more significant to them, right? Because they're small, they're weaker. There are also people who like cannot um cannot like help themselves to heal in a mature way. So it's more likely that they're going to attribute bad things that happen to them with their own self-worth and internalize um, those bad thoughts about themselves because they think that they shouldn't be calling people who do this behavior bad people and they shouldn't like let these people be punished. So don't want punishment. Yeah, and that's why it makes these kids all the more vulnerable. Yep, so those are some thoughts that I have on the motion. As stated before, like you can entirely disagree with this, you can entirely have a totally different interpretation of it. And if I do somehow meet you in person or come across you, I would love to hear your thoughts on this motion as well. But these are my preliminary thoughts, and I hope this helps some of you, if not everyone. Okay, all the best for all the other competitions that you're going for. Bye bye. Oops. Oops.